First of all, I'd like to thank the Anti-Corruption Academy for this opportunity to speak to an audience that is very concerned, I believe, in reducing corruption or eliminating corruption. I would like to speak about Malaysia's recent experience with corruption and also the things that this new government of Malaysia plans to do in order to eradicate corruption. I think everyone is familiar with the saying, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So if we don't have power, we will not be corrupt. Unfortunately, governments must have power, and of course, members of the government have opportunities to do wrong things, to be corrupted, to accept bribes, etc. Now, since we cannot do away with power, we need to find ways of reducing or eliminating corruption. We do so normally with laws which regard corruption as criminal. In other words, if you do something that is considered to be corrupt, then the law can be used against you, and hopefully that will deter people from corruption. But the laws are found in almost every country which is against corruption, but corruption still goes on. Malaysia had laws which are against corruption, and yet for a period of almost 5 years, Malaysia became very corrupted because the government in power at that time abuses their power. In particular, the Prime Minister abused the power and used to bribe people in the effort to win support for himself so that he can continue to be the Prime Minister of Malaysia. Now, I believe that corruption is something that is preventable, but it needs a great deal of effort on our part. Corruption normally begins with people who are in power realizing that if they withhold something that they should do for applicants, then the applicants would offer money to the officer concerned, and the officer then delays approval deliberately so that he will be offered bribes in order to approve any application. So when an officer receives an application and he accidentally delays the approval, he finds that the applicant would then offer money in order for him to approve the application. And when that happens once, the officer knows that by deliberately delaying approval, then he would receive bribes. The bigger the application that was applied for, the bigger the amount of money that he will get if he delays approval of the bribe offered to him. But we can have laws, but laws by themselves cannot succeed. We find that in some countries, corruption is almost total. It reaches from the top to the bottom. But in other countries, corruption would be minimal. Why is this so? Why is it that some countries are able to deal with corruption, but some other countries are quite unable to stop corruption? In fact, the people who are supposed to govern the country would themselves be very, very corrupt. I believe that culture has got a lot to do with your attitude towards corruption. If you believe that corruption is wrong, then you will withhold yourself. You will ensure that you do not fall into this crime. But such culture can only be cultivated when a person is very young. So from the very young age, we need to inculcate in them the belief that corruption is a crime, that it shouldn't be committed, that you should avoid receiving money or anything when you are giving some application or some approval for anything. If that is ingrained in your mind, then as you grow up, you will reject corruption, or at least corruption would not be so common in such a country where the culture against corruption, the feeling that corruption is a crime, is prevalent among the people in the country. If you have that culture, then laws are themselves not really necessary. But of course, not many people can resist the temptation. Therefore, we must have laws in order to prevent corruption from taking place. Now, Malaysia recently had a government that was obviously openly corrupt. It was under the sixth Malaysian Prime Minister, corruption became so common that the Prime Minister himself is involved in corrupt practices, practically in stealing money belonging to the people. Now, he believes that with cash, you can buy anything, including support for you in the election, if you have the cash. So he believes that cash is king. Cash determines what you do, whether you accept corruption or you don't. And because of that, he believes that if he could give money to the people would always be voting and supporting him and his party. But the Prime Minister doesn't have much money of his own. So how does he get the money? He conceived a way of setting up a company, a government company, and this company borrowed 42 billion Malaysian ringgit, Malaysian dollars. That's a very big sum because in the government there is a ceiling beyond which you cannot borrow. But by creating a company that belongs 100% by the government, that company does not have to follow the government ceiling for borrowing money. So by setting up the company, he was able to borrow huge sums of money, and the money was used partly to bribe people. The money was eventually stolen. Until now, we have not been able to trace and get back the money. And that money was also used, of course, for his own pleasure. And as a result, people expect the government to give them money for free. They didn't realize that it was corruption. It is wrong for the government to try and buy popularity by giving money to people. But what happens, of course, is that the government had to borrow huge sums of money and then finds itself unable to repay the loan, or it would take decades before the huge loans can be repaid. So when faced with that situation, of course, the economy of the country was unable to grow as much as it should. For example, doing business would be very costly because it involves paying the officer or the politician money in order to get approvals for whatever it is that you want to do. So the cost of doing business increases. Because of that, the cost of living also increase and people suffer from high cost of living, not being able to pay for those things which they commonly would have been able to buy with their salary. Over time, the people suffered a lot because of the cost of doing everything has gone up, especially getting approvals from the government, like asking approval for a passport, for example. They would have to pay money before they can get their passport. But every day, people will have to pay money to the government in order to get approvals for anything. So the total country, the total government became corrupt. And the Prime Minister not only was he corrupt, but he practically forced the government machinery to be corrupt. So much so that senior officers in the government demand for money for doing whatever it is that they should do as their duty. So the cost of everything goes up because of corruption. And many things do not get done simply because bribes are not paid to certain people in the government. The people suffered a lot. And because they suffered a lot, they wanted to get rid of this government. But the government was very powerful, and it punishes people who do not accept its policies, including to do wrong things for the sake of money. But the people believe in non-violence. The people did not take to the streets, nor did they have strikes in order to combat corruption. But they patiently waited until elections were held. And the 14th election was held in May of last year. And because of their disgust with the government, they gave, for the first time in 60 years, because the same party was governing the country for 60 years, but this time around, the people voted against the government party, and the opposition coalition won the election. Something that we never really expected to happen, but such was the disgust of the people with the government's level of corruption, that despite their fears, they voted against the government party. This is truly people's power. Only the people can do this. And this can be done if elections are held. And elections sometimes can be a lot of cheating in elections, but despite the cheating, the massive support for the opposition coalition was such that it came in the victor in this election. Now, having won the election, we have to deal with all the ills that were caused by the previous government, among which, of course, is the corruption, the extent of the corruption in our country. We need to try and eliminate that, and we have to do everything possible to, if not stop corruption, at least reduce corruption to a low level. We have decided that the whole government, the Prime Minister and the ministers must dedicate themselves towards getting rid of corruption. They themselves must not be corrupt. And this is, of course, enforceable because we have an anti-corruption agency that can take action against anyone, no matter what his rank may be. If there is proof that corruption has taken place, then the anti-corruption agency will take action and charge the person concerned, and therefore nobody feels he is safe if he carries out something that is not permitted. But beyond having the anti-corruption agency, we need to get the officers, senior officers of the government also committed towards fighting against corruption. We have set up an agency that we have set up a group, a committee, a big committee, where senior officers of the government will attend the meetings and where the Prime Minister will be chairing that meeting. And each ministry needs to tell the Commission what it is doing in order to eradicate corruption. And we also study the processes, the work that has to be done so as to know that it doesn't offer opportunities for the officers to become corrupt. So every month or so, the meeting is held and we study what has been done, whether the injunctions of government are being followed or not by the officers. Also, the procedures, bureaucratic procedures, must be such that opportunities are not given for government officers to be corrupt. So we want to shorten the bureaucratic practice so that the opportunities for corruption would be reduced. For this, we have set up several agencies which will oversee the performance of the officers of the government. But for the government itself, we require that all ministers, including the Prime Minister, must declare their assets and declare not to another politician, not to the party head, but declare to the anti-corruption agency. Of course, the anti-corruption agency may extend the results of their studies even to the Prime Minister, but the Prime Minister is not given any power to deal with this thing. These are done entirely by the MACC, the operating agency which deals with corruption. So by doing that, by shortening the process, bureaucratic process, we eliminate the number of occasions or opportunities for the civil service officers to become corrupted. And of course, the ministers too, having declared all their assets, they too must be very well aware that if they do something wrong or they hide something, and if they are found out, then action will be taken against them. However, we notice that in the last government, the Prime Minister was too powerful. He was able to direct civil servants and politicians to do wrong things because they owe everything to him, because they are selected by him and they are given these positions by him, so they feel obliged to him. To remove that, we now make it necessary for senior officers of the government to be selected by Parliament, not by the Prime Minister. Of course, he must have the approval of the King in the end. For the Prime Minister himself, we have limited the Prime Minister to 2 terms in office. 2 terms would mean 10 years. Actually, when I was Prime Minister, I served as Prime Minister for 22 years. Now nobody can beat my record. But the Prime Minister is also required to be open in every way and the press is given freedom to write against the government if they find that necessary. So all these measures were being taken. At the same time, we also realized that implementing officers from the government agency against corruption might be exposed to a lot of danger. People might want to take revenge and may even assassinate him. So we need to set up, I think, a fund to ensure that should anything happen to the officers, something is done for their welfare. These are some of the measures we have taken, and these measures will show results in time. But when I asked the implementing agency whether in fact the level of corruption has gone down or not since we took power, the new government took power, whether the level of corruption has gone down or not. I was surprised when he says that the level of corruption has gone up, not gone down. Because of all the measures we have taken, it has not gone down. Why there seems to be more cases of corruption now that we are having a new government which is dedicated to eradicating corruption? The reason is because now people reporting or whistleblowers reporting anything to the government will be safe. He is allowed to make a public statement accusing anybody of being corrupt. Of course, it must be based on facts. So because now they feel free to report, and they feel no fear that the government will take action against them as whistleblowers. The reports about the previous period has come up now, and the number has seemed to increase. But these are corruption committed during the previous regime, not the present regime. We expect that with the measures we have taken, we would be able to reduce, if not eradicate, corruption in Malaysia. It is very important that no one should be above the law. Whenever we have a situation where someone is exempted, then corruption will take place again. So we are now applying the law to every person in Malaysia, and nobody is exempted. That all corrupt episodes would be reported to the correct authorities, and they will be charged in the court of law. These are some of the measures that we have taken, and we believe that if such measures are properly enforced, then Malaysia would be able to reduce the level of corruption in Malaysia. I am always stressing that it is almost impossible to get rid totally of corruption. In some way, there will be corrupt practices, either at a lower level or at a higher level. But one of the most important things is that in the choice of government, in elections, there should be no corruption, because the will of the people must be reflected in the result of the election. And I believe that despite all the things that were done by the previous government to prevent the opposition party from winning, we were able to have an election where the pressure against the government party was so big that they lost more seats than they can manage. Some, of course, the election commission itself was corrupt, and that is something that affects the practice of democracy. So all in all, we feel that we need to take very many measures, not just using the law to prevent corruption, but instilling in the minds of people that corruption is a crime and should not be carried out by anyone, and doing this when they were still young, when they are still pliable or open to suggestion, the rate of corruption would be reduced, and as a result, the people will enjoy a good life because they will pay for everything at the proper price and not having to deal also with payment of corruption. I divide corruption into two stages. One stage is below the table, the other stage is above the table. It's done below the table or trying to hide when the person involved realizes that what he is doing is criminal, then he will try to hide. But in some instances where corruption appears to be accepted by the community, you don't have to pay to hide the payment. You pay for any service openly to the person who is giving you the service. At that stage, it would be very difficult for the corruption agencies to eliminate corruption. It's because everybody is involved, and even the Prime Minister becomes involved. At that stage, the laws will never be enforced. So when you reach the second stage, it will be very, very difficult to do anything, except if there is an election, then the people can reject the party that has been responsible for making corruption a general practice. There are many countries which accepts payment for services given by officers as a matter of course, as something that is normal. Once you reach that stage, it becomes very difficult to eliminate corruption. But while it is still under the table, while people are still afraid that what they are doing is criminal, I think there is a possibility for us to reduce corruption at least, if not eliminate it altogether. I thank you.